There's a time in your life, at least once, when you feel terror. And I mean true terror, when your chest feels hot, yet also frozen on the last breath you took. Time seems to slow. Your stomach becomes rigid, filling your throat with a silent scream. Maybe you run. Maybe you freeze up. Maybe you'll try to fight. But for those of us who have felt true terror, it becomes engraved in your bones so deep, it seems to change a part of your soul, a part of yourself. That being said, I want to tell you about November 20th of 2006. I grew up in a very Baptist Christian household, and at this time in my life, I was very young and susceptible to influence. When you're going to these kinds of things, there's talk about heaven and angels, and a lot of talk about the threat of hell, of damnation, eternal burning. That's kind of terrifying for an 8-year-old kid. Anyway, my family and I took a flight to Colorado. We'd gotten a small cabin high in the mountains, deep in the woods. We were so high up, my dad needed portable oxygen from altitude sickness. We were pretty secluded, other than the cabin next to us, about 3 acres away, though it was eerily hard to see through the snow-covered trees and foot-deep buildup of snow on the ground. Our first night was fun. We had a fire and roasted marshmallows and popcorn on long sticks. I had a good time. My 2 younger sisters and I even built a snowman. Now, the inside of the cabin was a very open build. There was a railless second-story loft with 2 twin beds, and under the stairs was our dad's bed. There was a little TV and an ugly blue floral grandma couch, which smelled like maple syrup. I slept on the left twin bed, closest to the edge and the stairs. My sister Bailey, who was 6 at the time, slept in the right, safer bed, away from the edge. Our younger sister Grace was only 2, so she slept with our dad downstairs. I slept pretty good that night. Probably the last good night's sleep I've had since, and I'm 23 now. It all started with some tapping. Early the next morning, I woke up from this annoying tapping sound. It wasn't like a pencil on a desk. It was more like the raspy clasp of something heavy and sharp, flicking its nails against the wooden floor. At first, I thought it was my dad. Honestly, I thought it could be bears too. I was a kid, and we were in the mountains after all. But I was wrong. The tap-tap-tapping, or ras-ras-rasping of that sound made me stay completely still in my bed. I had a habit of sleeping with the pillow on top of my head, so I knew I was pretty hidden. I made the decision to peek through the crack between my bed and the pillow. I looked toward the ledge, the part where someone neglected to put railing. I could see the straight drop-off to the living area and tiny kitchen. The massive windows without curtains really emphasized how alone we were in that cabin, how dark it truly is when you're miles away from city lights and protected by towering juniper and spruce. But there was something there, like a dark silhouette just on the overhang. It looked maybe like a blurred hand, just a few fingers, black in the darkness, gripping the ledge of the loft, tapping an extra-jointed finger. I froze. Nausea and chill froze my body. I held my breath. No, I thought to myself, there's no way I was seeing that. I slowly closed my eyes, and I faced away. It was going to be daylight soon. I usually woke up around 6 a.m., so there's no way I had to wait all night for Daddy to get up and sing loudly to us, "Good morning, girls. Demons can't be real. Monsters can't be real." That's what I told myself. I mean, I was a God-fearing Christian. We sang hymns in the car every time we drove. We went to private Bible school, vacation Bible school. There's no way God would ever let that happen to me, one of his children, right? Again, I told myself this over and over, reciting Bible verses in fear, whispering words so silently they came out between breaths. Prayers and verses I thought would make it go away. In my mind, I even commanded the thing to leave me be. I didn't know any better, but I certainly do now. After what felt like hours, but was most likely a few minutes, I felt the air around me go still a bit, the tension dissipating. I got brave and peeked one eye open, as small as I possibly could. It was gone. That weird hand or whatever it was gone now. It had gone silently, and I hadn't even noticed. I breathed with relief and rolled over to face the wall beside me. There was a small wooden nightstand with an old oil lamp, but slightly hidden behind it was a small seam, like the outline of a tiny square door frame. At that time, Coraline the movie didn't exist, but now I'd say it's very close to the perfect description. The similarity to the movie and these events are astounding. This door was a dark old wooden brown, like the muddy brown color, with deep hollows dark from being burned or stained. Eventually, I fell back to sleep. Later, when the sun finally came up, I talked to my dad about the tiny door. My sisters and I hid downstairs while he investigated. Soon he called us up to come see it. It was a tiny room similar to a storage closet, with a few gallons of water and firewood inside. Nothing to worry about. Even Grace crawled inside, and Dad took a picture. The second night is where the story truly begins. I was worried about being scared again that night, so I asked my dad to leave a light on for me, so I could see during the night. He didn't like the idea that much, so instead he made a fire in the fireplace and put up the chain guard for extra protection. Then we went off to bed. The fire burned well for several hours. To be honest, I spent more time watching the shadow of the flames dance up the high triangular ceiling than I did sleeping. I wonder now, if I'd actually slept, would I have gone through any of this? Soon those flames dwindled down, from sparks and embers to a mere orange hue. I turned away, now facing that ominous tiny door. As soon as I did, I was startled by a tap. That same repetitive sound drilling into my skull once again. But it wasn't coming from behind me, it was coming from in front of me, from behind that door. I thought it was a trick. I thought it was just me imagining something, a small branch shaking just the right part of the roof so that the door snapped. There was no way a monster could come after me. I was saved and protected. And monsters aren't real. Then there was silence. I peered through my cocoon of pillows and blankets, exposing my eyes. I felt I had to see it, to see if it was something or someone. I don't really know what I was thinking. As I opened my eyes, sharp, elongated fingers pulled back between the seams of the door and frame. It somehow melted through the tiny crack like an apparition. Suddenly, the door started to shake, and a loud scratching sound grinded across the other side of the door. It was so loud, even my sister stirred a bit in bed. I could hear her, or I hoped it was her. The sound behind the door masked it, but I felt in my soul that there was some movement, some presence behind me now. It had to be Bailey. She probably heard it too, and was going to run and tell Dad. I hoped she would. Another scraping sound, the sound of talons getting caught in each of the layers of wood. Then the fire went out. All at once, the orange halo of light that outlined the edges of the room disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark. Was my sister there? I swore I could hear movement. I convinced myself that sound was her. Then there was a bang. The door shook, and at this point I was so still in fear, my muscles cramped, and my breath was shallow. I was probably breathing in and out 20 times a minute. I tried not to breathe at all, though. Another bang. Something behind the door was knocking. It was hitting it, hard, as if someone was hitting it with a fist. Banged each time I felt myself shrivel up, becoming stiffer and stiller, as if I could shrink myself. Bang, 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 bang. The loud thuds vibrated through the air. I could almost feel my heartbeat match its rhythm. Bang, bang, bang. Would you stop it? Bailey had finally woke up. Her words were followed by silence. I hear another shift, and my bed moves. Jade, would you... Her words stopped abruptly and were followed by a deafening scream. She screamed, but I didn't move. I stayed completely still. It wasn't her that had bumped my bed. It wasn't her who I felt sitting at the edge of my beat. Whatever it was, Bailey had seen it, and it was on my bed, and it had been in that tiny closet beside me. My tears overflowed, spilling down my face even though I forced them shut. I didn't want to see that door. I didn't want to see that thing. Bang! The door was pounded on with the force of a football player trying to break it down. The wood bowed and bent from the immense power of it. Banged, banged, banged. Something inside me, something I couldn't control, caused me to start reciting Bible verses again. Through shaky breaths and shock-filled tears, I prayed. More movement on my bed. Banged, banged, banged. Then stomping came from the stairs, followed by, "What's going on up here?" My dad. My prayers had worked out, but I couldn't sigh with relief yet. I continued my desperate pleas. I couldn't keep my body completely still anymore. I was shaking. Every muscle in my body contracted at different times. I felt as if I was vibrating from fear, from the pain of my stillness, from that thing that had now slowly made its way to my side. Its claws had kept getting caught on the knitted quilt above my thick comforter. I'd felt it pull away at it a few times. Another bang. My heart sank. After that last bang, there was a change. A pop or a click. I couldn't figure out what the sound was. I looked. Two deep, sunken-in eyes, hollow and black, surrounded by what could have been a face, but it was too pale, maybe just white. A face that seemed to have no blood flowing through it. In that moment, I believed it was a demon, that the devil himself was looking me in the eye with an overgrown or maybe cut-out mouth, making it curve all the way up to the high cheekbones beside its eyes. I knew it had teeth. I could tell, and I knew they were sharp. Whatever it was, the thing smelled, and it was thin. Behind its head, I could see some sort of black hair-lined sash or coat that had been decaying over time. But those eyes, they were like craters, with dark spiraling layering in the middle. Two once human eyes, bloodshot with cat-like irises, not in the sense that they're slit, but more like the red-yellow flash they make when you shine a light into them. In a split second, it leaned away from me, taking one last pause before zipping across the room. It sounded like it leapt to the floor, but I couldn't tell. I was stuck there in shock. My eyes stared forward, just as they had been when it was there. But now that it had moved, that tiny door was in clear view. It was open, not too wide, but enough to see inside. There was a loud scuffle. My sister and Dad screamed. I still stared at the opening behind the door, and out of the darkness, two shining eyes peered back at me. My dad grunted and yelled. I could hear a thud downstairs, followed by the front door crashing down. Apparently, whatever that thing was, it had tackled my father, clawing a gash across his chest before tumbling off the edge of the loft to the floor below. The creature busted out of the door. My dad had fallen with it and was knocked out. Bailey wailed and cried. I could hear Grace downstairs in bed screaming, babbling about, "Daddy, wake up," or "Daddy, oh no." I could feel the freezing winter air blowing through the cabin, but I didn't move. I didn't blink. I stared back at those eyes. We were there for hours, Dad still unconscious, and Bailey had somehow managed to grab the radio or a phone and call for an emergency response. We were so snowed in by then, the national park nearby had to plow the road twice to get to us. One truck had somehow stopped working. They blamed the cold or maybe battery issues. I don't remember. By the time the second snowplow had made its way to our street, my two sisters had crawled into Bailey's bed with all of what was left of the blankets. They'd kept themselves going with hot cocoa powder, Cheez-Its, and a jar of peanut butter. A 2-year-old and a 6-year-old left to fend for themselves with a half-conscious dad. And there I was, their older sister, still frozen in the same exact place. I never looked away. The park rangers came in, taking off their jackets, trying to wake up our dad without much success. But he was still alive. They started a fire and placed the door in the open doorway on top of a small pile of snow that had accumulated there. When the police and ambulance finally arrived, there were helicopters flying above us. I could hear the blades chopping the air, making the tree branches snap and shake. The last thing I remember was being pulled onto a stretcher, my gaze torn away from that thing in the dark. My family and I never talk about that cabin. We don't discuss what happened that night. Now, as an adult, I'm not so religious anymore. But I still celebrate the earth and practice spirituality. I have a few ideas as to what it could have been, but it doesn't really matter. Sometimes, I still see those long, clawed fingers curled around a door frame before evaporating away. Maybe one day, I'll really find out what it is.
This happened Easter of last year. My husband's family owns an old farm with a large property with mountains, lakes, and woods. No one lives on the farm anymore, so we use it as a holiday residence. This is west in Norway, so fords and mountains and lots of red deer all over the place. No neighbors, and no animals except wild ones. There are old ruins from the Viking Age about 500 meters from the house, nearby the lake. Much unknown history that I find every time I come here. But the forest on this property is incredibly eerie. I'm Norwegian, and my ex, the father of my kids, is Canadian. He's not much around anymore, and my daughter, who is 10, is very fond of horror movies. My son, 9, also likes a good scare. To help them not forget their Canadian culture, I told them about the Wendigo. This was in the car on our way to the west for Easter holiday. Since there was so much deer out there, I told them a story that I've read on the internet about a Wendigo mimicking kitten sounds. I told them that these Norwegian mountains are the same as the Appalachian before the continent split up, and that's maybe why they can be so eerie. Maybe there's some remnants of Wendigo left up here. The second day there, we cut down some small trees outside the house. The kids and I dragged the branches over a small field and tossed them down a hill. This hill is where the forest begins and also the path down to the lake. My husband was in the garage, the other direction, fixing the chainsaw. As we took a break by the tree line, my son, with the Wendigo story in mind, starts to make a special cartoonish cat meow that he thinks is funny into the forest. He kept going maybe 6 or 7 times, before I told him to knock it off and get back to helping us with the branches. We turned around, and then, out of nowhere in the silence of the woods, there was a very clear meow coming from the bottom of the hill. It sounded exactly like my son's voice, though. It wasn't my son. He was standing right in front of me, and I could see that he didn't make a single noise. We shrugged it off as someone hiking and answering the meowing, and I didn't want to scare the kids too much, at least not for real, and didn't feel like I needed to remind them that it's private land and nobody except us would be here, because the only walkable path is through the garden and small field. We got up to the garage, told my husband, and went inside for lunch. It was just like, well, I guess there's lots of spirits in these woods. And then we didn't talk about it again. He's a man of few words and not easily scared. He grew up on the farm and spent every vacation of his life here. He knows the land well and thinks it's incredibly mystical, but not quite scary. My husband actually reminded me of this meowing story in the car on the way to Easter this year, and we still can't figure out a rational explanation. So we've kind of just landed on it being a forest spirit, or maybe a very interesting fox. I went camping with my wife and stepdaughter the other night near Laguna Mountain in California. We were off the main road in a secluded route that seldom had cars passing by. No foot traffic through the area at all whatsoever. We heard a noise late during the night that honestly could be explained logically by something natural that we might not know about. However, my wife and I have both been losing sanity trying to understand what that noise could have been, or what could have made that noise so far out in the woods. The first occurrence of the noise occurred around midnight, and we can only describe it as a slow, deliberate, rhythmic nail scratching on the tensioned paracord straps that we were securing the tent with on the ground. Naturally, we thought it might have been a critter curious about the tent, but the slowness and the rhythm of the noise makes us believe otherwise, because critters like that generally scratch quickly and sounds more hasty, like they have something to do. The other conclusion that led us to believe it wasn't a critter was because of the fact that throughout the night, we actually did hear squirrels running around outside, curious of all of our stuff that was there. Now, why this detail is important? Because during that time leading up to the noise and the time after the noise, we heard absolutely no critters outside running up or away from the tent. Whatever was creating the noise was absolutely silent coming up into our tent. And eerily enough, it may have even been floating or something of that nature. We never saw any footsteps or any footprints or anything like that. We did hear it again around 2 a.m. that same night, and during that specific episode, the noise seemed to have shifted from one corner of the tent to the other, closer to our heads, allowing us to even feel the vibration of the scratching reverberating throughout the floor of the tent. That's what leads me to believe that this was no sort of animal. I also believe that the paracord strips being so taut helped the tension vibrate even more, making this maybe even a little bit more pronounced for us to see, or feel, I should say. We may have heard the noise again a third time, but it seemed weaker the last time, and we eventually fell asleep. My wife and I are very disturbed when we think about this story. It honestly kept us awake most of the night on high alert. I don't even think I fell asleep until I saw the first sunrise. Better be honest, I would love to know if anybody in this swamp has any idea what this could be. It could just be something natural we could explain. But I like to think there might be something more going on here. It was the summer after my freshman year of high school, when my family decided to take a vacation to Yellowstone National Park. We'd rented a rustic cabin in the woods just outside the park borders. I remember clearly being excited to spend a week surrounded by nature and trees instead of concrete and cars. As an avid reader, I planned to spend most of the trip curled up on the cabin porch, devouring my books. The day we arrived at the cabin, the sun was high overhead, casting dappled shadows across the dirt driveway. My parents and my younger sister, Amy, piled out of our SUV while I grabbed our bags from the back. The cabin owner, an elderly man named Walter, hobbled over to greet us. After introductions, Walter led us inside the two-bedroom cabin. It was quaint, with wood-paneled walls, patchwork quilts, and a stone fireplace in the main living area. The musty smell inside reminded me of my grandparents' basement. Walter showed us around, pointing out the small kitchen, bathroom, and bedrooms. "Well, I think that covers everything," he said, rubbing his wrinkled hands together. "You folks need anything, just give me a holler. My house is just a mile down the road." We thanked him as my dad handed over a check for the week's stay. Walter pocketed it and shuffle-stepped toward the front door. But before he left, he turned back to us with a strange look in his pale blue eyes. "One more thing," he said in a low voice. "I suggest you folks stay inside after the sun sets. These woods ain't quite right at night, if you catch my drift." My dad chuckled uncomfortably. We're city folk, Walter. I think we can manage." Walter nodded slowly, his gaze drifting over each of us. "Oh, I'm sure you can. Just keep the doors locked and curtains drawn after dark. You'll be wanting to stay inside, trust me. Well, you folks enjoy your holiday now." With that ominous warning lingering in the air, Walter exited the cabin, leaving the four of us staring at each other. "What a kook," my mom said with a nervous laugh. My sister Amy looked uneasy, her brown eyes wide. "I'm sure he was just joking around, trying to scare us," my dad offered, though he didn't sound convinced. "Come on, let's get unpacked and figure out some activities for the week." We busied ourselves putting clothes and supplies away in the old oak dressers and cabinets. The odd encounter with Walter soon faded from my mind as I daydreamed about spending the week reading out on the porch swing. As the sun began to set, we cooked some hot dogs and beans over the crackling fire as I tore through pages of The Divide by Elizabeth Kay. The howls of coyotes echoed in the distance as we laughed and talked over the snaps and pops of the flames. Full and content, I said goodnight and retired to the room I was sharing with Amy. Amy was already there, curled up under the covers of the twin bed closest to the door. I quietly changed into pajamas, then switched off the bedside lamp between our beds. Moonlight filtered in through the curtained window, creating shadows that swayed gently in the night breeze. Somewhere out in the dark forest, an owl hooted. The call was soon answered by the forlorn cry of the coyote. I rolled over, closing my eyes. I felt myself beginning to drift off. But just as sleep was about to overtake me, a bizarre sound pierced the night. A sort of drawn-out wail or howl that seemed to waver and warble unnaturally. My eyes shot open, now fully awake and alert. The odd howling sounded again, even closer and louder than before. It clearly came from somewhere right outside in the woods surrounding the cabin. I sat up slowly, glancing over at Amy's bed. She appeared to still be sleeping soundly. I then turned my attention to the window behind me. I noticed the curtains there were still partially open. I thought about getting up to close them, but a feeling of dread kept me pinned beneath the covers. The unearthly howling and wailing continued at sporadic intervals. With each eerie cry, a cold knot of fear grew inside my chest. I didn't dare peek out between the curtains. I was terrified I might see something peering back at me from the dark tree line. At some point during the chilling chorus of sounds, I realized Amy was no longer in her bed. How could I have not noticed her get up? Had I fallen asleep at some point? Heart pounding, I squinted through the moonlight at her empty, disheveled sheets. Slowly, I shifted my gaze to the center of the room. A small gasp escaped my lips. Amy stood there, staring blankly out the window through the opening in the curtains. I stared at her silhouette, my heart drumming loudly in my ears. She was standing unnaturally still, arms hanging limply at her sides. "Amy?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the ongoing wails from outside. She gave no indication of hearing me. I said her name louder, "Amy," but she remained frozen in place, her gaze fixed on some point through the partially open curtains. The terrible cries rose and fell again and again, sending shivers up my spine. Swallowing down my fear, I slowly peeled back the covers, sliding my legs off the bed. The wooden floor was like ice against my bare feet. I took a tentative step toward my sister. "Amy, can you hear me?" I asked, my voice quivering. Still no response. As I crept closer, I could see Amy's face illuminated in the silvery moonlight. Her eyes were open, but glazed over and vacant. It was like she was in some kind of trance. I followed her stare out toward the woods, but all I could make out was darkness and swaying branches. The awful wailing erupted again, louder than before. I flinched, the hairs on my arms standing at attention. Fighting every survival instinct urging me to flee, I closed the remaining distance and reached for my sister's rigid arm. "Amy, say something, you're freaking me out." Before I made contact with her arm, Amy's head suddenly snapped towards me. I stumbled back with a gasp, her vacant eyes now piercing into me. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but then her head swiveled back around to face the window. My breaths now came in panicked gulps, my heart slamming against my ribcage. I knew I needed to get away from the window, away from whatever lurked outside in the dark forest, whatever it was that had entranced my sister. "Hey, come on, let's get back in bed," I managed to choke out. When Amy still didn't budge, I grasped her cold hand in mine. I gave her a gentle tug, and to my immense relief, she followed me without resistance. As we shuffled away from the window, the unnerving howls outside subsided, replaced by the normal night chorus of insects and owls. The knot in my chest finally loosened once we were back at our beds. I helped Amy get under her covers. It was the summer as you like or any sparko in my fairway decided to take a vacation of beaches or Miss Dole National Park, her brown eyes dull and unfocused. That was like part of her mind was still standing over by that window. "Just try to sleep," I told her, as I tucked the blankets around her small frame. She said nothing, merely staring past me at the ceiling. Exhaustion beat at my mind and body, but I knew rest would not find me easily tonight. Moving quietly, I closed the curtain fully, shutting out the moonlight. The room was abruptly cast into inky blackness. I crawled back into bed, my icy feet seeking warmth beneath the sheets. Pulling the covers up to my chin, I lay there staring into the void, straining to hear any sound from Amy's side of the room. But besides the pounding of my heart, all was silent. Eventually, I drifted off into a fretful sleep, my slumber plagued by screeching cries and vacant eyes. I jolted awake just as the first muted light of dawn crept across the ceiling. For a moment, I just lay there, listening. But no wailing cries pierced the morning stillness, just a few chirping birds from the surrounding forest. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and sat up slowly, casting a cautious glance toward Amy's bed. Relief coursed through me at the sight of her sleeping form, blankets rising and falling rhythmically with her breath. The empty, trance-like stare from last night was gone. Her face was relaxed and peaceful. I wondered if she even remembered what happened. As I got dressed and prepared for the day, I mulled over whether to tell my parents about the bizarre events of the previous night. Would they just brush it off like we did with Walter's initial warning? Should I talk to Amy first and find out what she saw or experienced? In the end, I decided to wait and observe my sister's behavior when she woke up. If she seemed confused or scared, then I would tell our parents something frightening had happened. But if Amy acted normal, I thought it best not to rehash the unnerving experience. I sat on the living room sofa, watching the shadows retreat across the yard as the sun rose higher in the sky. The whole forest now appeared tranquil and inviting. It was hard to imagine the haunting sounds which echoed between the trees just hours before. I hoped that whatever occurred last night was just an isolated incident, that the remainder of our vacation would be peaceful and uneventful. I tried to act normal as Amy eventually emerged from the bedroom, hair a mess from sleep. She gave me a quizzical look as I watched her shuffle to the bathroom. "Whoa, what?" she mumbled through a yawn. I shook my head, relief flooding through me. "Nothing. Sleep okay?" She shrugged absently before disappearing behind the bathroom door. When she rejoined us in the cozy kitchen for breakfast, I studied her closely for any signs of that vacant stare or unease from the previous night. But she seemed her usual cranky morning self, slumped over a bowl of cereal. So I guessed I wouldn't be mentioning anything about the strange events, unless she did first. After eating, Amy planted herself on the living room sofa to watch cartoons, while my parents discussed possible hikes for the day. I mumbled something about going for a walk, and slipped out the front door unnoticed. I brought one of Darcy Coates' horror novels with me, one of her many ghost stories. Can't remember which. The morning sun filtered brightly through the trees, warming the ground and raising the birdsong a few decibels. I followed a narrow trail away from the cabin, fallen pine needles and twigs crunching under my sneakers. The surrounding forest appeared perfectly normal. No traces of the ominous noises that pierced our dark hours. I wondered if somehow it had just been a bizarre dream, or a figment of my imagination. Then again, the vivid image of Amy's blank stare and rigid form refused to fade from my mind. Lost in thought, I didn't pay much mind to where my feet carried me, until the trees began to thin. I emerged from the forest onto a deserted dirt road that stretched onward through the woods in either direction. Glancing back, I realized how far I'd wandered from the cabin. I considered turning around, but curiosity nudged me forward down the road. Around a bend, a weathered wooden fence came into view, with a crooked hand-painted sign which read, "No trespassing, private property." I paused, peering through the fence slats. There appeared to be a small, overgrown pasture on the other side. Deciding I wasn't technically trespassing from the road, I continued on. That's when I first noticed the trees. Every towering pine and spruce that bordered the pasture was marred with strange markings. It looked as though some massive beast had raked its claws vertically down each trunk, stripping away chunks of bark. I ran my hand over one of the gashes, feeling the sticky sap left behind. Unease trickled down my spine as I hurried farther down the road to inspect the other trees. All of them bore similar claw marks, with no discernible pattern or purpose. It was as if something had wandered through the forest, indiscriminately shredding every tree within reach. I backtracked away from the disturbing sight, skin prickling as though I was being watched. When I was once again surrounded by undisturbed nature, I left the road and pushed deeper into the dense forest. The sunlight barely penetrated through the clustered evergreens, blanketing the ground in murky shadows. Every snapping twig made my heart jolt as I forged ahead aimlessly, until suddenly I stumbled into a small clearing. I froze. makeshift wooden structures encircled the area, fashioned from twisted branches and some sort of cord. Crude symbols and shapes adorned the structures, though I couldn't decipher any meaning from them. In the center sat a small altar-like pile of rocks, topped with bundles of feathers, beads, and bones. The entire bizarre scene exuded an aura of dark, primal energy that seemed to hum in the air and tingle against my skin. Suddenly, I felt like an intruder, trespassing on something ancient, something malignant. I backpedaled from the clearing, urged on by the suffocating sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Only when the strange structures were far behind me did I stop to catch my breath. I leaned a palm against a sturdy pine. A shudder passed through me as I imagined what sort of twisted creature, or person, could have constructed those things. The normal forest sounds of bird call and wind seemed muted, replaced by a heavy silence. I couldn't shake the certainty that something uncanny lingered out here, just out of sight. I arrived back at the cabin winded and on edge, hoping I appeared less unnerved than I actually felt. My dad raised an eyebrow at my disheveled state as I hurried past him to wash up. Over lunch on the porch, my parents discussed visiting Old Faithful the next day. When there was a lull in the conversation, I hesitantly described the odd markings I'd found in the woods. My dad frowned while my mom suggested it was just wildlife or kids messing around. "Well, I think it's best if we all stay close to the cabin today," said Dad, tone casual but firm. I met Amy's gaze from across the table, an unspoken awareness passing between us. She knew the cabin grounds were no longer a safe haven. We both did. We were intruders here, and something ancient and watchful lurked just beyond the tree line, waiting for the cloak of night to descend once more. We spent the rest of the afternoon playing board games on the cabin floor, but I couldn't focus on anything besides the approaching nightfall. An undercurrent of dread flowed through our forced conversations and half-hearted laughter. As daylight gradually faded outside, our words trailed off entirely, replaced by strained silence. Once dusk settled around the cabin, like an oppressive shroud, my dad stood up to draw the living room curtains. I watched him check the lock on the front door twice before retiring with my mom to their bedroom. Back in our room, Amy and I lay side by side in tense stillness, ears straining in the dark. The comforting sounds of our parents preparing for bed in the next room gradually went quiet. I thought about asking Amy if she wanted to talk about yesterday, to see if she would open up about her eerie trance by the window. But fear kept me mute, words frozen in my throat. Eventually, Amy's breath slowed into the steady tempo of sleep. I tossed and turned restlessly, unable to silence my racing mind. Each minute that ticked by on the glowing bedside clock filled me with increasing dread as the witching hour approached. Around 1 a.m., an unearthly howl pierced the stillness. I jolted upright, my heart lurching. The wailing cry was soon echoed by another and another. The bizarre chorus rose and fell in erratic undulations, filling the night. My eyes instinctively flicked toward the window, but this time, the curtains were tightly drawn. I realized Amy must have done that earlier, while I was in the bathroom getting ready for bed. The awful sounds swelled outside, inhuman voices layered upon each other in a cacophony I had never heard before in nature. I imagined hordes of creatures moving stealthily between the trees, features obscured in shadow as they crept closer to our cabin, called by some ancient rite. But nightmare suddenly became reality. A tall humanoid silhouette glided past the bedroom window outside, briefly blocking the scant moonlight seeping out from behind the heavy drapes. I froze, skin erupting in goosebumps. Something was right outside. The silhouette lingered by the glass for several heartbeats before slowly continuing past, its misshapen head seeming to turn toward the window as it slid out of view. Hot tears of panic welled in my eyes as the phantom shape faded back into the night. I slowly turned towards Amy. As expected, she was sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes round, filled with terror and the darkness. Anguished sobs racked her body, her hands clamped tightly over her ears. She was even so terrified, I could see her drying blood from where her nails dug into her skin. Amy, it's okay, you're okay," I whispered urgently, helplessness and guilt swirling within me. She remained locked in her mute nightmare, writhing silently against some invisible demon. Swallowing down my own fear, I stumbled over to her bed and wrapped her in my arms. She struggled, head shaking back and forth, refusing to fully resurface into reality. I choked back tears of my own as I gripped her tightly. "Amy, it's me, your brother, I'm right here," I murmured like a mantra, rocking us gently as the hateful cries raged outside. Eventually, I think it worked. She went still, rigid in my embrace, no longer fighting. Even so, her small frame continued to tremble. We stayed huddled together as the wailing gradually faded back into silence. Exhaustion overtook me as the adrenaline drained away, and I gave in to sleep. I was startled awake sometime later at this rattling sound. Blurry eyes searched the room before identifying the noise. It was the doorknob to our bedroom, slowly twisting back and forth. Someone or something was trying to get in. Still holding on to Amy, barely breathing, I watched the old brass knob rattle ominously, but the door itself stayed firmly closed. After an agonizing minute, the rattling ceased. Heavy footsteps moved past our room, creaking down the hallway toward the living room. The front door groaned open, a winter chill spiderwebbing across my skin. The footsteps paused on the threshold. Then it left, disappearing into the night, the door remaining open. Only then did I fully comprehend how close we'd come to a horrible fate. Some sort of creature or intruder had made its way inside the cabin during the night because someone hadn't closed the door completely. Luckily, it found itself barred from entry to our bedroom. If that bedroom door had not been locked, I don't know what would have happened. Thankfully, my parents' bedroom door was locked too. Terrible visions of them being slaughtered in their own beds flashed through my mind. There would be no more sleep for me that night, as I clung to my sister, grappling with the bleak knowledge that a flimsy door with an even flimsier lock was all that stood between us and this unspeakable horror that roamed from the woods and into our cabin. The next morning, a feeling of gloom hung over the cabin. We all picked at our breakfast in silence, eyes downcast. The cheerful morning light filtering through the windows seemed to mock the despair that had settled upon us during the dark hours of the night. As soon as the sun had risen, my dad went outside to start packing up the car. His face was pale when he came back in, but all he would say was that we were leaving as soon as possible. My mom fluttered around, tidying things with trembling hands before tossing the last few items into our suitcases. I could tell she was on the verge of tears, but was fighting to hold herself together. Amy sat curled up on the sofa, gaze unfocused. She had not said a word all morning. I wished I could comfort her somehow, convince her she was safe now. But the light of day did not feel like sanctuary anymore. There really was no escape from what happened last night. Within an hour, the car was loaded up and idling in the driveway. I took one last look around the cozy cabin that had become our cage, our fragile shelter from the darkness. Part of me wanted to beg my parents to stay, thinking maybe things would be better now, but I knew deep down that we were right to flee this place and never return. The drive home was solemn and silent. Amy slept fitfully in the back seat while I stared listlessly out the window. Now that we were away from danger, my mind churned with questions. What were those creatures that prowled the woods, making those sounds? Why did they target us? And what would have happened if it had gotten in our rooms? Worst of all was the vacant, tortured look in Amy's eyes whenever the creatures came and howled. I shuddered to imagine what nightmarish visions she must have glimpsed through that window. What evil did she see that had brushed her mind and left its claw marks on her sanity? Even away from that place, she was scarred in a way I could not understand. The next several days passed by in a haze. Amy stayed curled up in her bed, hardly eating or speaking, except for occasional violent nightmares that wrenched her from her sleep. My parents tiptoed around her, offering her reassurances neither they nor I believed. Our lives were irreparably ruptured. About a week after returning home, I was reading in my room when I heard the front door open and close. I looked out the window to see Amy hurrying down the street, moving with purpose for the first time since we got back. I dropped my book and raced outside. She'd made it a few blocks before I caught up, and by then we both were panting. She glanced at me when I grabbed her shoulder, but she pulled away from me and continued on. I followed at a distance. She wound through side streets and alleys. Eventually, we reached the outskirts of town, where sagging abandoned warehouses lined the train tracks. Graffiti spattered their gray walls beneath broken windows. Amy slipped through a hole in a chain-link fence and approached the nearest warehouse. I lingered by the fence, watching as she produced a lighter from her pocket and flicked it alight. In one smooth motion, she hurled the tiny flame through the nearest empty window frame. I don't know what the small flame hit, but somehow flame sprang up and engulfed the dry wooden interior. Amy's face seemed to glow in the firelight as she watched it burn. I backed away, frightened by this specter my sister had become. When the sirens eventually screamed in the distance, Amy finally turned away from the inferno and made her way back to me. Together, we snuck into the shadows and returned home. I didn't tell anyone what Amy did, because somehow it made her seem happier. She seemed to have purged some of that poison from her soul. In the following days, she seemed to come out of her catatonic state. She became more engaged with friends and family again, less prone to trance-like staring fits. I held out hope that the horrors of that cabin would fade to the past for both of us in time. But some deeper instinct warned me that the scars ran too deep for Amy. These fears were confirmed a year later when I walked in on Amy in the midst of a seizure. Her eyes rolled back, limbs flailing about. I tried to hold her still, yelling desperately for my parents. Suddenly, Amy's back arched up as she choked out a guttural scream unlike any human sound. When I looked down at her face, she seemed so far gone. Then her rigid body went limp, and she passed out. Later at the hospital, tests and screening couldn't determine what caused her episode, but I knew. Some sort of splinter of darkness, which had infested those woods, had burrowed inside Amy. In the years since, I've watched my sister struggle against that latent evil, fighting to keep it buried down in her psyche. I often consider urging Amy to discuss what horrors she glimpsed in the window that night, hoping that confessing it might offer some deliverance. But seeing the way her eyes cloud with dread at the mere mention of that time, I know better. Some memories are too dangerous to stir from their unquiet sleep, but too strong to ever fully cleanse. The only mercy I can offer my sister now is silence. I'm a park ranger, but I'm intentionally leaving my name and the park's name out of this post. The names of all those involved have been changed as well. I needed to get this story out there, but could not rely on conventional avenues. That's why I'm posting it here. I could lose my job or much worse, but this story has to be told. I owe it to Catherine. I arrived at the ranger station like any other day. I was given my section of the park to patrol. Unfortunately, the park is massive, and my section usually includes half of it, so there isn't much chance for strolls on the trails. I hopped in my work vehicle, a 10-year-old 4x4, and headed down to see if anyone needed assistance. It didn't take long to find someone. At the first campground, a man couldn't get his camper started. A quick jump got him rolling along. Next was a couple needing directions, then an overturned canoe. I had only made it a few miles through the park at this point. I would have to move if I hoped to make an entire route today. I grabbed a few quick bites of lunch and put some miles on without anyone needing help when the call came over the radio. A hiker had found something, and I needed to go check it out. A half hour later, I talked to a middle-aged woman who had made a concerning discovery. She found a hat and a note on the trail. I read the letter. I'm writing this note and leaving it behind because I'm not sure what's happening. The 5 of us friends have been planning this trip forever, even since long before our graduation. But it's always seemed like something came up the last minute and one or more of us could not go. I was almost convinced that some outside force had been working against us for a while. We were cursed to not go camping together until we were too old to enjoy it. I could picture Devin now. He would still go even if he was too old to walk and suffer on the trail. He's always up for camping. I think the guy carries a loaded backpack in his car with himself everywhere he goes. Adrian got here right behind us, followed soon by Dean. Of course, Terry was last to show. We started up the trail in great spirits. 3 miles in, the sun was just starting to heat up. We were making good times toward the rustic campground when Devin decided to take a detour. He said he had heard about an old trail that no one used anymore and wanted to check it out. I said we should keep going the way we were, but I was outvoted. I honestly don't think Terry's vote should have counted since he was stoned, and Devin just bullied him into saying yes. We came to a spot with a large stone off the trail side. Devin said it was the trailhead, but I didn't see any path. He led us through some heavy brush, but on the other side it cleared out. We could see the faint impression of an overgrown trail. I went last and left my hat on the stone just in case we got lost and if we need to be rescued. I think that's precisely where we're headed, straight toward being lost. I'll leave this note under my hat and hope that someone finds us. I asked the woman to show me where she had found it, and she showed me. 3 miles later, I was staring at the rock I had hoped I would never see again. I radioed my location to the station and told them if they didn't hear from me in a couple of hours to send a search party to the old abandoned trail. I wish I had brought my supplies with me. My backpack and sidearm were 3 miles away, and I didn't know how long these kids had been on this trail. I knew that any wasted time could mean the difference between life and death, not only for myself, but for those kids. At least I had my knife, my flashlight, and binoculars. So I thanked the woman, placed the red hat back on the stone just in case, and headed into the heavy bush. Once through the initial overgrowth, the trail became more visible. Old memories flashed through my head, ones I never wanted to think about again. I took a deep breath and headed down the path. It was overgrown for the first mile and opened into a field. I could see people had walked before me because the weeds were partially trampled. As I walked through, a deer jumped ahead of me, startling me. Until that moment, I didn't realize how jumpy I was. I tried to settle down and tell myself that these kids were just lost and I could catch up to them and get them out. I was telling myself that, but that didn't make the memories go away. I entered a clearing with a fallen log and another note with a rock was sitting on it. Think I'm being silly. This trail isn't so bad. Maybe I was wrong. Devin seems to know where he's going. Just can't shake this feeling that we're being watched, you know? Sometimes I'll look around and I swear I see a face disappear behind a tree. Am I being paranoid? Maybe if the birds started singing again, that would lighten my mood. But I haven't heard any of the birds or any other animal for a while. I wonder why they're being so quiet. Are they afraid of us? On another note, Terry seems to be brooding more than usual. Maybe he forgot to bring enough of his stash to last the trip. Devin, in his glory, since everyone has to rely on him for directions. Adrienne and Dean seem to be along for the ride. However, I have noticed Dean looking around at the trees as well. Maybe I'll ask if he sees anything. If you're trying to track us down, I hope you aren't being too bothered. I just have this feeling things are gonna go wrong. I folded the note and stuck it in my pocket, then prayed she was wrong about being followed. I pushed on, beginning to miss my backpack with the supplies, especially the water bottles. The trees provided shade, so the sunlight wasn't shining directly on me, but hiking is always thirsty work. The birds chirping in the trees made me almost forget about the desperate mission I was on to save these 5 kids. My mind wandered back to the kid I couldn't help. It had been shortly after I started as a park ranger. An 11-year-old boy had gotten lost on this very trail. His parents searched for him before calling us to look. I remembered hoping to be the one to find him as we formed search parties and searched on, in, and around every inch of the trail. In the end, I got my wish. I found him, but I wish I hadn't. I pushed the memory to the back of my mind and focused on the trail. It was starting to fade. The trampling of feet wasn't making enough of a difference, and I was beginning to lose my way. Out here, that can be deadly. I kept moving forward and finally regained the trail just in time to reach the fork. I looked back and forth from one choice to the other and couldn't really see a difference between the two. I searched for any broken twigs or plants that would give me a hint, but there didn't seem to be any. Just when I was about to give up and flip a coin, I saw a piece of paper in the weeds, barely visible. I dug it out and read it. It seems like we have a dilemma, a fork in the road, as it were. You would think I would be happy to see the doubt in Devin's eyes as he looked from one choice to the other, but you'd be wrong. It made my confidence plummet. It made me think that we were never going to get out of here. Everyone's running out of water. Devin yelled at us for not conserving, but I saw him drink the last of his. He ranted and raved at us for a while, but we all knew he was just mad because he didn't know what to do. In the end, he flipped a coin. We all did our best not to laugh. Adrienne is reaching the end of her rope with Devin and his attitude. Dean has been playing peacemaker, trying to keep them off from going at it too much. Terry has been way too quiet. I haven't seen him light up once. Something's up with him. But he says it's nothing every time I ask. The birds still aren't singing, and it's bothering me to the core. This strange feeling I have hasn't gone away. I asked Dean if he had seen anything weird, but he won't talk about it. We've been on this trail for some time. I'm hoping to come to an end soon. In case the note got moved or blown around, we took the left trail. I was panicked by the end of reading that note, and was so relieved when she mentioned which path to take. I radioed in and reported that I was on the course of the missing hikers. I told them I was at the fork and that I took the left side. I was told that there was no search party going on yet, that I was the only one looking for these kids. It was the complete opposite of years ago looking for that kid. Everyone was searching. I know we combed every inch of that wilderness. But that's the thing about the woods. You can search every nook and cranny visible, but something can still stay hidden. The sun was going down and I still had no idea how close I was to catching up to these kids. I could stumble across them in the next clearing, or they could be hours ahead of me. I met the woman who showed me the hat and note in the afternoon. If they started around daybreak, they could be 5 or 6 hours ahead of me. If the leader is driven to continue, it's hard to say how far they might be. I continued following the trail until I saw a fallen tree across a river. I looked both ways along the river's edge, but didn't see a path, so I crossed the tree. I could picture the debate the kids had when they got there. I chuckled at the thought of Devin having to convince them to go across. I believe I made up a lot of time with that single crossing. I jumped into the water, drank my fill, and climbed back up feeling much, much better. It was tough to pick up on the trail on the other side. I was glad to find a note sticking to a branch. Oh my gosh, Devin just about came unglued when we got to the tree over the river. He hopped up right away and started to cross, but the rest of us weren't so sure that the trail led that way. We asked him how he would obviously know this, but he said he planned this fallen tree as a part of it. He sputtered, stopped, and told us that we would be lost without him. Dean had finally had enough and told him we were lost because of him. I thought Devin would swing at him until Terry came to his side and told Devin to shut up. The rest of us all came together and told Devin he could keep leading us as long as he stopped acting like a freaking petty tyrant. He didn't take that too well, though. In the end, he told us we could all go to hell. He sat on the log and refused to move. Eventually, we took a break, refilled our water bottles in the river, and Dean said we should keep going and led us across the tree. Devin followed along, acting like a whipped puppy. Dean and I talked about the disappearing face we had seen a while back, but neither of us had seen it again. At least the birds were back singing. I chuckled, figuring that Devin would be a big baby over the whole thing. But after the chuckle came concern. Deposed leaders are usually dangerous. I wondered how much offense Devin had taken and how long it would take before he started getting some sort of payback in some small or large way. Darkness was coming on fast in the woods. I had to make a decision, camp for the night or keep going. If I camped, I could defend against the predators that lurked in the darkness. But if I kept moving, there was a good chance I could stumble across the group before daybreak. It wasn't much of a decision. These kids that I don't even know, that I had plunged headfirst into the woods without even my backpack of supplies. Of course, I was going to try and catch up with them. If I had done that years back, would that kid still be alive? Such thoughts nagged at me. Most days I kept them at bay, but here, in this same forest, close to where I found him, I needed to focus. If I'm going to get after them, and I'm going to keep up, I need to get going. I stepped off the trail to take a pee and heard a metallic snap simultaneously, and I felt intense pain shoot at my leg. I looked down and I had stepped into a bear trap. I screamed, I fell to the ground and rocked back and forth in agony. After a few minutes, I refocused on getting the trap off of my leg. I found a branch and pried the weapon open. Screaming the entire time, I pulled the surprise off my leg and threw it to the side. I didn't want to take my boot off, but I had to see the damage. It took every ounce of effort I could to muster enough to unlace that boot and pull it off. My leg was purple. I felt along the wound very gently, but there didn't seem to be any break. That didn't mean I wouldn't be limping for the next month, though. But it did mean I would buy this brand of boots for the rest of my life. Putting the boot back on took much more effort and screaming, but I knew I needed to keep going. I laced up the boot and found a sturdy branch to use as a crutch. I struggled to my feet and took my first few ginger steps. Once I got into the rhythm, it got more straightforward, but I couldn't walk as fast as I had been. Of course, when I was weakest, I heard footsteps in the trees close to me. I knew it had to be a predator, because it could probably sense how I was vulnerable and probably heard my screams of agony earlier. I leaned against a tree and held my crutch ready as a weapon. The footsteps came closer. They paused as if they knew I was ready, then slowly continued stalking me. They were deliberate but slow. Each step seemed measured as if it were waiting for the right moment to strike. I heard it right next to the tree I was hiding behind. I whipped around as best as I could and raised the crutch to strike. A deer was staring at me for a heartbeat and then turned and ran through the forest. I collapsed against the tree and slid down to the ground, allowing the adrenaline to bleed off. I don't remember falling asleep. I woke to sandpaper scratching the side of my face. I opened and a bear was beside me, licking my cheek. I freaked out, screamed, and rolled away from it. The bear wasn't ready for that reaction. It startled and ran away. I slowly but rapidly contained my breathing and looked around. It was dark. Thin shafts of moonlight beaming through the trees provided a little bit of light. I checked my watch and it was nearly 4 a.m. I rose slowly and gingerly on my injured ankle, took the small flashlight out of my pocket, and prayed it still worked. My prayers were answered when the beam shone brightly through the woods. I panned around, trying to get my bearings. After a moment, I found the trail and started hobbling toward it. The nightly noises were a comfort. At least if the crickets were chirping and the rest of the forest was singing its nightly tune, predators likely weren't around. I stumbled and fell, hitting my injured ankle against a rock. The pain overwhelmed me and I screamed. After a few minutes of recovery, I got up and continued at a slower pace, paying more attention to the ground. I chided myself for falling asleep and losing so much time. At least the trail was easy to follow. I continued through the night, hoping I wasn't too late. I started thinking about the boy I had failed to rescue and what would happen if I failed to save these kids too. I'm sure the Rangers department would say I did my best. I wasn't worried about them, it was me who I cared about. Would I be able to forgive myself for letting something happen again? My thoughts were interrupted when I stumbled into a clearing. Not just any clearing, there were remnants of a fire. There were impressions from tent pegs being pulled out of the ground. All around were the signs of a recent campsite, including a tent still set up entirely. I got so excited I nearly fell over my crutch, looking around for signs of anything. The tent was a mixed blessing. It was very ominous that it was still here while the others were gone. but I could find some supplies to take along for my search. The most important was food. I shoved some protein bars in my pocket while devouring some beef jerky. I also grabbed 2 water bottles from the pack. I stumbled across a note sitting under a rock beside the smoldering fire. Before I sat, I held my hand up to the fire. It was still warm, but the embers were nearly dead. It had been hours since this fire was first lit. I would have thought that I could catch up with them if I hadn't taken such an unintentional nap. There was nothing I could do but sit by the dying fire and read the note, hoping there was good news. We found this clearing and decided to camp. Everyone was tired from walking and the mood was somber because no one seemed to know where we were. We had been hiking in the forest before, but none of us had ever seen or heard of this trail. We set up our tents, started a fire, and then ate and sat around. No one felt like talking, so I tried to get the ball rolling by asking Terry why he was late. He hesitated, but at my prompting eventually told us that he had hit an animal with his car on the way here. I asked if it was a deer and he said no, it was much too big to be a deer. He said it was walking upright on 2 legs and was massive, like 8 feet tall massive, covered in brown hair. He swerved to miss it, but the strangest thing was it seemed to try to jump out in front of him, like it wanted him to stop. We all listened with rapt intention. Just then, off in the distance, we heard a scream. We all froze. Devin started spouting off and yelling at Terry for trying to scare us, storming off. Dean tried to stop him, but he pushed him away and disappeared into the woods. The rest of us talked, trying to decide if we should look for him, but in the end, we figured we would just let him go and cool off. We heard a rustling off in the distance and a muffled cry a short while later. We huddled a little closer together and went on high alert. Our eyes darted back and forth as we searched the impenetrable wall of trees surrounding us, looking for any signs of a predator. Right then, the strangest thing happened. All the nightly noises stopped. The crickets, the squirrels, the owls, and every sound you usually hear in the forest at night ceased. It was unnerving. For a moment, I wondered if I hadn't gone deaf. Our eyes darted all around in the darkness. We all huddled closer to the fire. Dean pulled out his hunting knife. None of us said a word. It was like if we spoke, something terrible would happen. Somehow, whatever caused the noises to stop would find us if we spoke. Someone did say, though just not who we expected, "Why are you here?" Came a deep, raspy voice that seemed to echo from everywhere. We all looked around and finally, a man, at least what I would like to call a man, stepped into the light. It was oversized, well over 6 feet tall, broad shoulders, and probably older than any of us combined. It was also wearing what looked like a park ranger's uniform. It looked old and shabby, like he had been wearing it for a long time. There were no name tags or park patches. At that point, we didn't care. We had been rescued. We clamored around him, saying how glad we were that they had found us. We told him about what was going on in the trail, and we weren't sure where we even were. The man listened, slowly saying, "You should be here." We all looked at each other, freaked out. I'm sure the others thought the same as me. It's no shit we shouldn't be here. We just told you that. He looked at us from one to another, as if he were sizing us up. I was starting to get a little uncomfortable with this silence. I thought he would offer to guide us back, but he didn't. He kept staring. I think everyone else was getting a little edgy when Dean asked if he could point us in the right direction. He looked at Dean as if deciding to answer him or not. "I encourage you," he said. "But first, you have the house rest." We all agreed that the day had been long and stressful. We decided to take his advice and turn it in. We offered him some food and water, but he refused, saying he wasn't hungry. We each went to our tents and laid down. Now, the one thing that just stayed on my mind was how weird his voice sounded. It sounded almost demonic, almost like something trying to pretend to be human. Before I settled in and finished this note, I popped my head back out of my tent to check on our guide. He was sitting by the fire, staring into the orange coals. I thought I heard him mumbling or maybe humming something softly. I quietly zipped up my tent and went to sleep. Sometime later, someone banged on my tent. I awoke and unzipped it to find the ranger with a strange look in his eyes. "We need to go." "Why?" I said, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes. "It's not safe here," he said with an edge of panic. I popped back into my tent to change, then came out and met with everyone. They were all in states of semi-consciousness as well. Everyone but the ranger seemed to be confused. "Pack up. We need to leave," he said a little more forcefully. I was about to protest when I heard a piercing scream. His head shot up, and he stared in the direction of the sound. "Move it," he said. "Back up." We didn't need to be told again. The scream brought us all fully awake. We tore down our tents repeatedly and packed up everything into our backpacks. As I finished up, I noted Devon's tent was still standing up. "Where's Devon?" I said. "Who's Devon?" the ranger said. "He's another one of our friends," I said. "He went off into the woods right before you got here." "He didn't come back?" the ranger asked. "Should we go look for him?" I said. The ranger extended his arms and did a slow circle. "Which way would you go?" he said. I understood his point. How would we know where he had gone? If he was still on the path or not? It just seems like we should do something. "What about his gear?" I said. "Do we take it with us?" The ranger looked at me, almost like he was annoyed at answering so many questions. "Leave it here, in case he comes back," he said. "You'll need his supplies." I'm not sure if I'll keep leaving notes or not now that we have a ranger to guide us. Whoever finds this, please look for Devon and make sure he's okay. After reading this note, I was perplexed. A ranger? All the rangers at this park are in their 30s or 40s. Maybe it was someone who retired and was just roaming around out here? Or why would they be out here in the middle of the night? And why would they be in some sort of ranger's outfit? Sitting here by the dying embers of the fire, with a tent set up in front of me, it was very tempting to take a rest. If they're in the hands of a capable ranger, I could get some rest before the long hike back out of here. But I knew I already had taken my rest for the night. If not for that, I would have been here hours ago, probably before the other ranger. I set out again, feeling tired but determined. The campsite made me more hopeful than I had been all day. At least they were together and thinking like campers. If only I knew who this ranger was. The sun was an hour away from rising, so I took up my flashlight to follow the trail. I zipped up the tent before I left, just in case the owner returned. I wouldn't want animals getting in and taking everything. It's bad enough when injured park rangers do it. The trail stayed level for a while as dawn peeked over the trees slowly. The course started heading upward, which was terrible news for me and my bum ankle. It made things much harder, but I had my trusty makeshift crutch to help me. Dawn crept into the forest, giving me a little assistance. At least I wouldn't have to waste a hand on holding a flashlight. As the climb grew steeper, the trail grew more narrow. At times it was only the width of a foot. As I scaled the narrow path, I held onto trees and whatever I could. At the most difficult, I paused and seriously considered turning back. As I looked around for any other way to keep going, I saw brightly colored fabric at the bottom of the ravine. I carefully balanced as I took out my binoculars and looked. It was a backpack, and attached to it was the body of a girl in her early 20s. She looked like she had hit her head on the rocks at the bottom. Her face was bloody and mauled. Her clothes were ripped and soaked in blood. There was no doubt that an animal had gotten to her. The only question was she alive when it started feeding on her? I looked away, but I felt my determination doubling down to find these missing kids. They might be with the ranger, but they were still in terrible danger. I slowly continued up the narrow trail. At this time, I was sure the ground would give out from under me, and I would share the same fate as that poor, unfortunate girl at the bottom of the ravine. It was then I remembered my radio. I tried to call in and report the location of the body, but the only response I got was static. I was determined to try again when I got to the top of the trail. It was yet another motivation to keep going, to be careful and to survive. It seemed like hours at a snail's pace, working my way up the side of the ravine. Finally, I clawed my way over the top of the edge. I rolled over onto the solid ground and lay there for a few minutes. Once I caught my breath, I got up slowly and painfully. I hadn't done my ankle any favors. I limped toward what looked like the trail and began following. It wasn't long before I came across the remnants of another campsite. The fire was a little warmer than the last one. I stoked it up, threw some more wood, and got it going. I knew I needed some rest. I searched around, found a note, then sat down on a log by the fire to read it. I can't believe Adrienne is gone. We started up this steep ravine, and the trail kept getting narrow. I asked the ranger if there was any other way around it, and he just glared at me and said no. We all struggled with our heavy packs on our back. At one point, I was on all fours just trying to keep from sliding into the ravine. That's when it happened. Adrienne was having trouble keeping her feet on the trail. She kept slipping. I reached out and helped her balance a few times. Being right in front of me, I kept an eye on her whenever possible. But to be truthful, I wasn't watching nearly as much as I wanted because I was watching my own feet. She slipped once. I tried to grab her, but she had tipped over. The weight of her pack dragged her over the side. I watched in horror as she tumbled down into the ravine, bouncing off trees as she went. I saw her skull make a tangible impact several times as she tumbled down to the bottom and slid to a stop. I wouldn't know if she was still breathing or not as I called her name. She didn't move. I reached for the ranger in front of us and pointed to her unmoving body. He stared at her for a long time. I don't know if he was trying to see if she was alive or not. He told us to keep going up the trail to the top, and he would check on her. I watched as he carefully made his way down to the nearly sheer slope. We kept moving forward as instructed. He was only halfway down when we made it to the top. I was a wreck. I was so happy we made it, but sad for Adrienne. I didn't hold out much hope that the ranger would come trotting back into camp with her on his back, saying she only had a few bumps and bruises. We started the fire and sat around in a stupor. Finally, Terry came over and talked to me. "Look, I understand she was your friend, but she was ours too," he said. "We need to work together to get out of here, for them." "This is so stupid. It makes no sense," I said with the remnants of a smile. It was then the ranger reappeared. He sat by the fire and didn't say a word. There was something in his eyes. It wasn't sadness, but I don't know exactly what it was. We knew she wasn't coming back. We rested for some time, then started on the trail again. "If you're following us, I hope you're being careful. Stay safe." Well, this girl is something else. She wants me to be safe with all she's gone through. I hope I find her. I think she'd make a great park ranger personally. My guilty conscience jumped up on my back and yelled at me. How can you sit around and rest when that girl just lost her friend and needs your help? I knew it was right. I just didn't know why the other ranger was so careless. I struggled to get up, kick out the fire, and started after them. The daylight was dimming, but it only was 8 in the morning. I looked up and saw why. Storm clouds were overtaking the sky. Yet another reason I wished I had brought my backpack along. The raindrops hit like cold slaps in the face. Even though it was still September, out here in the mountains the weather can change in a heartbeat. We weren't at the top of the hill, but in the middle was enough for the weather change to make me shiver. Now that we were out of the ravine, I tried my radio again, but it was still static. I knew there were some places where the radio inexplicably wouldn't work. I just hoped to escape the interference before it was far too late. The trail was clear in front of me, but that was little comfort when walking in open fields with no rain cover. All those trees I tromped through, and now in the rain, I have wide open spaces. I'd say someone doesn't like me. The rain didn't just pass like a spring shower. It poured so hard it became difficult to see even an inch in front of me. For a long time, I trudged through the rain. At times, I felt like I was walking in place. The mud was starting to cake on my boots, and then my salvation appeared. In front of me, on the trail, was a tent. I called out before I unzipped the tent and let myself in. I flopped to the beautiful dry floor, quickly turned and zipped the entrance back up. I breathed a sigh of relief, but a stench assaulted my nose as I did. I looked over at the sleeping bag. It was full. "I'm sorry to barge in like this, but I need to get out of the rain," I said. No response. I nudged the person in the bag. It tipped over to the side and rocked right back. That's when I noticed the splotches of red that had soaked through the bag. I didn't want to see, but I pulled the top of the sleeping bag away from the person's face. The bad part was that they no longer had a face. It had been ripped away, and the neck had been gouged out. There were large wounds on the body as well. I tried to feel for a pulse, but my fingers went straight into the neck muscles. I figured there was no pulse to feel. I wiped my fingers on the sleeping bag and pondered why this person was covered. I know the animal who did this didn't gently cover up the person with the sleeping bag when it was done. I found my answer lying above the head on the person. It was a note. "I can't believe Terry's dead. I wish I'd never come on this trip. I wish I'd never let Devin bully us into turning down this damn trail. Where the hell is Devin anyway? When he stormed off on his little pity party, did he run across whatever creature has been stalking us? Is he sitting back in his tent now, enjoying himself? I don't know. We enjoyed not climbing up the face of a ravine, but we were exhausted. I mentioned stopping and camping for a little bit to the ranger. He looked at us and even sniffed the air. That seemed like a weird thing to do. But after that, he agreed to let us set up camp. He even told us to do it quickly as we could. We gathered wood for a fire, and then he told us not to bother because the rain was coming. I guess that explains the air sniffing thing. Our tents had been up for maybe 15 minutes since it started raining. It quickly turned into a downpour. We all offered the ranger to sit in our tent with us. He looked over us, one by one. It was pretty creepy. Finally, he said he would sit with Terry in his tent. Dean and I looked at each other with relieved expressions. The ranger is helping us after all, but he isn't someone I'd like to ever see again. He just acts too weird. At times, I wonder if he's even helping at all. I just closed my eyes, listening to the rain on the tent and letting it carry me off to dreamland. When the ranger ripped open my tent, he said we needed to pack up right now, that something was hunting us. We dove out into the rain, miserably packed our tents, He reassured us that there was a cave nearby that we could get to for shelter. As I was packing up, I didn't see Terry, so I went to his tent and knocked. When there was no answer, I went in and found what was left of his body. Something had torn him to shreds. I covered my mouth to avoid vomiting and ran the hell to the others. Dean and the ranger looked in and saw what was left of him. The ranger said he had left the tent to go to the bathroom, and when he came back, he saw a predator hanging around the tents. That's when he came to wake us. It must have already gotten to Terry. I pulled his sleeping bag over his head and wished we had given him a proper burial. But the ranger said the animal might be back for the rest of us, so we quickly packed up and left. I barely had time to finish this note. Please help us. A cave? What kind of ranger is he? Doesn't he realize that this is most likely where some sort of large predator would call home? I thought for a moment about what cave they could be talking about. I haven't been on this trail for some 5 years, ever since I found the kid here. Then it hit me. We were very close to a place where we found the kid. Why would he take him there unless... I jumped up so quickly that I nearly fell on top of the body when I forgot that if I put too much weight on my injured ankle, I'm gonna collapse. I hobbled out of the tent and went as quickly as possible toward the place I swore I'd never see again. I approached the cave and my heart sank. 2 backpacks sat just inside the entrance. I pulled out my knife and flashlight, then cautiously peeked inside. I felt a change in the breeze and turned to find the ranger staring at me. I looked him up and down. You, I said. The last time I saw you was when we found the boy. He said nothing. It was never a random animal attack, I said. It was you. Oh, plus you years ago, as you floated around, he will surprise her. You son of a... I pulled out my knife and held it ready. He paused, then smiled. You think I got your meat? I looked at it. Pretty sure, I said. It's made of iron. His smile vanished. I pulled out a bottle of brown water. I made sure to grab some runoff from the rain store, I said. It might not do as good as rust water, but let's find out. I opened the bottle and threw some water at him. He dodged it as though it was acid. At the same time, I swung with the knife. He escaped it with ease. Why won't you show me your true form? Use them. Yeah. He swung and connected with my stomach, knocking the wind out of me. I recovered and swung the knife in a vicious downswing at him, which he easily dodged. I kept moving forward, stabbing and slashing at him, not giving them any chance to think or rest. I couldn't get close enough to connect. He was somehow way too fast. If I hadn't been injured, I probably would have been able to close the distance between me and this thing. This thing is something I've only read about in lore before, but never thought was actually real. Unfortunately, I forgot about my injured ankle in the heat of the moment. I stepped forward on my good leg and faltered when I tried to put weight on the injured one. Instead of burying the knife in his heart, it went right through his left thigh. He screamed in pain and ran out of the cave. I took out my flashlight and started toward the back of the cave. There, I found a mutilated body next to a pile of bones. There was a note in her hand. I sat down, took it, and read. I can't believe how stupid I was not to see this much sooner. All the time guiding us was just a ploy. He never wanted to help us. He never cared about any of us or our safety. I need to write this quickly before he comes back. The ranger led us here and told us to wait here and that we'd be safe in the cave. He left us alone. Dean pulled out his flashlight and explored more profound areas into the cave. He found a large pile of bones. Off to the side of them was a pile of clothes. We ran toward the opening, but the ranger had already returned. So, listen, he said, leering at us. What are you? I said. He smiled for the first time since I'd met him, but his smile wasn't comforting. It was terrifying. I watched in horror as he changed into a giant cat-like creature. It didn't look quite like a panther or a mountain lion. He lunged at us with incredible speed. He grabbed my leg and tore a large gash into it. I fell into the floor, screaming. Dean tried to defend me, swinging his knife around and holding it at bay, but it stalked around him and cornered him. He only had one chance. He looked at me with sadness and then ran past the creature and out of the cave. It looked at me and then my leg. then sprinted out after Dean. I know why he did it. He was trying to give me time to escape, but with my leg, there was no way. I couldn't outrun anything. What he did do was give me the time to say goodbye. If you're reading this, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I led you to your death. If you somehow survive and make it out of here, please tell our families what happened. Goodbye. I fought back the tears as I read the final words of this brave girl. I limped out to the front of the cave and looked out as the rain stopped. It was like seeing a new world being born. I tried my radio and got an immediate answer. I gave them my GPS coordinates and told them to prepare for casualties. I'm still a park ranger even months later. I made sure that the trail was sealed off. I carry an iron knife and rust water with me at all times. I have the rust water and a squirt gun just in case. The bones were removed from the cave and subjected to DNA testing. Aside from this group of victims, including Devin, several others had gone missing in the park over the years. The official version of the events was that a rogue animal had been hunting people. I was told it was best for my career if I didn't reveal the true nature of the predator. I still search for the creature and post signs everywhere to look for an older ranger wearing a uniform with no patches. There's a number to call if anyone spots him. It's my cell phone number. Occasionally, I hear reports of a large cat limping on its hind leg. I try to make my way to that spot as quickly as possible, but I have yet to catch him. I posted this story in memory of that brave girl, but also as a warning. Never go on an unposted trail and beware of those you meet in the woods, even if they wear a uniform. They may just turn out to be something we can't comprehend. A creature, hidden and lost from history.